Welcome back, brothers and sisters. Today we're going over my complete review for Space Marine 2 because there's been a little bit of a warp anomaly for feedback on the game. Is it very positively reviewed because it's insanely fun, or is it actually a 60 out of 100 once you've gotten past the honeymoon stages? Hopefully by the end of this I have that answer for you while I break down all the positives and negatives of the game, because we do have some serious problems. And before we run into that like weird shill issue where people just use like toxic positivity to deny like the the glaring issues with the game, you need to understand that constructive criticisms are to help things improve over time so the games we love can get better over time. Whether that criticism is positive or negative, it is to try and help things improve, because it's not about me putting the game on blast because it sucks. The game is actually really fun to play when you get to play it. So lighting this off, we'll start with, in my opinion, the biggest selling point of the game, the campaign. There's no words to describe how amazing and cool it really is other than the live reactions. So if you don't want extreme campaign spoilers, skip to the next timestamp. You've been warned, because just talking about this and comparing it to anything else isn't fair. There's just nothing that matches this campaign that I've ever played.
Take up the Canadian standard and hold it high.
This is awesome. Take one more. That's one of the coolest screenshots I've ever taken in the game, dude. That is so cool. That is just so fucking cool. Okay. That's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. What happened over here? Having a good time, Commissar?
You underestimated
the Did you see that shit? What?
On that abomination. Yes, my lord. Captain, form a defensive line here.
Bro, what?
Defensive line.
I'll take a picture of that.
Brother Titus, you will have only moments to execute your plans. Move quickly.
Yeah, oh.
Yeah.
I remember seeing this. Oh!
Where are the traitors?
Is he just going in? Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, what the fuck? Are you serious? He just threw that shit into it?
Go.
Yes! For the Emperor! Blast him! This is so fucking sick.
Oh, they switched my guns.
Jesus Christ, this is the best thing I've ever done, bro. This is so fucking cool.
Get up!
Yo, Galgar tells you to get up, you just do it, bro. Let's go! So the experience is unmatched, but there are some mixed feelings about it if you play on difficulty 4 and some pain points on 3, which is what we played on to see what the devs intended. It took us about 8 hours of exploring like everything, and I mean every small little detail we just went crazy with. We took like 1,000,000 screenshots, like it was super cinematic. And I'm a true Guardsman fanboy, so the fan service for me was basically like unmatched, and it was just like a fever dream the entire time. Everything for me was just super cool and over the top, like just looking at everything felt really good. But if you speedrun it, the campaign takes like 6-ish hours, and we were sold closer to 12. So there was a pretty massive disconnect here for the difficulty that they intended you to play on. And unfortunately, on difficulty 3 and 4, you do have extremely limited playstyle options if you're not trying to do like a challenge mode run, because all the bolt weapons feel like Nerf guns. And when you're playing the campaign, they set the stage with the tutorial mission for how bolt guns and chainswords should feel. But once you start normal progress, the enemies are scaled around the Spec Ops PvE mode, so the standard bolt guns they give you can't really kill anything. The easiest solution, in my opinion, would be to give you pickups of weapons that make sense for that difficulty. Something like purple weapons on D4 in campaign would round out like 99% of the problems with it. And I think it's important to bring up how limited the weapons feel in a story mode where you're supposed to be a mega badass, and the only thing that really makes you feel that way are like the melta and plasma guns. Now, the main pressure point playing on the highest difficulty is raw damage taken because of how borked the health system is, and takes us into the most egregious problem in the entire game: enemies shooting through walls. It can happen in every aspect of the game. Some walls just aren't real, but mainly you'll notice it in PvE and probably from some hackers in PvP. But the first half of the campaign is where it's a real issue. This area won't make sense until you get here, so it doesn't ruin any campaign experience or cinematic or anything, but the enemies just shoot through the side pieces, all of the boxes, and like, as a note, I didn't have a problem with any of these in the second half of the campaign, but enemy shooting through walls isn't just a campaign problem. It's also a PvE special operations issue. And if you've played the campaign or ops on the hardest difficulty, you know that every enemy has like this insane level aimbot where they just cannot miss. So you end up constantly having your HP drained out most of the time by things that you can't even see, and it does so much damage that the counterplay is to just W key at them or die. And on the hardest difficulty for Spec Ops, the level of accuracy of the weakest enemies is what ends up rotting your HP out more than anything else. The Termagants are supposed to be like a fodder chaff enemy on top of that, so there's no reason that they should be so pinpoint accurate. And on top of that, when you start playing against Chaos, you run into a lot of just terrible interactions for like every ranged enemy that just deletes even your armor, which is supposed to be range resistant. And when you're in melee, every 1000 submarine forces you to constantly wait for them to go first, and if you don't, basically you just get deleted. And if you watch anybody play on the higher end ops, you notice most people are always about 30% HP or lower, unless they're playing Bulwark or Heavy. This is mainly because the incoming damage is way too high, and the difficulty slider is to give all the enemies HP, which only makes sense after you've leveled and gotten all the legendary weapons. But the accuracy and damage that comes with it is very off-putting and didn't need to be increased. As a reference point, in the dev interview, the chief creative director, Tim Willits, talks about the Swarm engine where we're plowing through these hordes of enemies, of Tyranids, of chaos, and he paints this amazing picture where we're left with barely enough armor to survive because the AI director orchestrates the perfect battles. It also says it's okay to be overpowered in PvE, but not PvP. Now, the reality of what happens when you start playing the hardest difficulty is a spam roll fiesta, RPing as Dark Souls just so you don't get hit. And then you just trade damage when it's safe. It doesn't make you feel overpowered at all. It actually makes you feel like a glass cannon. So just to hold people accountable here, this is another case where we were sold OP and it was absolutely not delivered in most cases and is only true for some classes. Almost all of the pain points I have don't exist if you play Heavy or Bulwark because they are good at keeping their HP and armor topped off with solid skill trees and good synergies. I think that Heavy, Bulwark, and Tactical all have those amazing synergies between their perks, weapons, and skill trees. Sniper and Vanguard also do feel pretty good, but it's very noticeable how fluid and good they feel to play after comparing them to Assault, which has a lot of really bad, clunky interactions that feel horrible to play with. I will do a more in-depth dive on every class in the future, but as a summary, if you just want to have the most fun, most people picked up on this already, you're just playing Heavy because it's the W key super fun meta class. And one key issue that needs to be addressed is when you are random queuing, it shouldn't put you in games with people that already have your class selected. That seems like the bare minimum for matchmaking, and they miss that here too. And with the way the game's set up, they also need to level and loadout gate the harder difficulties because there's no reasonable way for a random level 1 to be able to contribute properly to a Ruthless game because of the damage difficulty slider. Now on the defensive side, the game just turns into try not to get hit and spam roll. Even the big three can get their HP pumped if they're not careful, and in a lot of cases makes me feel like we got our Primaris Marines off of Temu. So what needs to change is how our characters take damage and how we regen HP. That way we can fight the hordes of enemies we were promised and take full advantage of the Swarm engine, which I feel is being underutilized to a massive degree in this game. And overall, the armor system, once you are fully leveled, does start feeling okay because you get so many ways to regenerate it. And just as a reference, most melee attacks will rip one full piece of armor off, and most ranged attacks will trickle it off if it's from the smaller chaff enemies. The larger enemies shooting you rip it off insanely fast. And because it's already such a big problem and there's going to be a tier up in difficulty next patch, armor values need to be drastically increased across the board against all ranged attacks. You really start noticing it against Chaos. It just isn't strong enough in its current state to warrant what it's supposed to do. HP also feels like really weak and needs a small rework to the way you regenerate it. When you take damage, it is in massive spikes, which is way too hard to regen on some classes, and is also why you see so many people below 30% on difficulty 4 when you watch them play, and it just leaves you open to getting rotted out by small enemies, which just feels really wrong in a game like this, and takes away from all the fun, cool, and interesting things it has to offer. In general, HP regen doesn't exist outside of contested HP, which is the white bar, but it also disappears so fast that you never really get to take full advantage of it with most classes and weapons, unless you have a Bulwark with this perk on your team that makes it degenerate 100% slower. After we got this on the team, like, it felt fair enough that it should be what the baseline is for every single character. And then having a Bulwark on top of that, it would be like ridiculously noticeable, but not mandatory for a smooth experience. And right now it feels like Bulwark is absolutely mandatory to have a streamlined experience at least. And lorefully, Primaris also regenerate a bit, so I think that we have 4 bars of HP, and if you're like halfway through one, it should passively regenerate up to the next section, kind of like your armor passively regenerates out of combat. There's also an HP stim debuff for tiering up in difficulty that should just also be removed because it makes them feel bad to use, and every single loadout swap station should also heal you to full. There's just, like, they're way too oppressive with the amount of HP that you have in the game. You're always below 30% if you're not playing like some super meta thing, and I think that feels really bad. This would let you trade damage in really fun ways into hordes of enemies and make the game a lot less punishing for one mistake. One mistake at the start of the game could punish you for the rest of it on a class like Assault, and that feels really terrible. So instead of that, you'd end up with a lot more of a thematic, like, fun experience, letting you take full advantage of the swarm engine and spawn more enemies to fight, giving us that experience we were sold on every single class, not just a handful of them. To clarify, this is not a problem with all the classes. When you're playing heavy, you don't have to care about any of this because you can just full blast your HP up constantly, which is obviously a problem. There shouldn't be one class with such a weighted advantage over everybody else, but I think that's baseline how all the classes should feel, not that it should get nerfed at all. Everything should be buffed to where heavy is. What I'm trying to depict here more than anything is that melee combat feels way too punishing and terrible and needs drastic improvements alongside the health systems that hold it back, because its only viability comes from those fencing type weapons, so you can spam parry because balance and block are both, again, they're shown as being literally worse. But I think that all 3 playstyles should be viable, and it's just a missed opportunity to be like, well, balance is worse than fencing and block is just worthless. I think like just these couple of changes would make us feel way better and like real Primaris Marines. And before I get accused of wanting the game to be too easy, you can see that's never what I've wanted with basically any game that I've played from any of my previous videos. And you'll see what I mean after you play the max difficulty, because the spam roll loop is just not very interesting, and it's also very weird to see Space Marines iframe spamming. They're supposed to be like walking tanks, basically. For a lot of the enemies that we're fighting, they just would not be able to kill us. It makes sense for a card effects or like a Neurothrope or like a Hell Brute, but like not a Gaunt. Like, the game is peak when you get to kill the massive swarms that the game can throw at you. You just don't get to do it enough. And these changes, they would let them spawn even more enemies for us to fight and give us that really cool, thematic, interesting experience. And in the current state of the game, if a higher tier difficulty is released, it's just going to end up being a spam one-shot fiesta that will be really boring to play. Enemy balance is also extremely inconsistent. If we compare a Guardsman profile to a Gaunt's profile, they're pretty much the same, but Gaunts regularly eat a ludicrous amount of damage, whereas the Guardsmen are literally comedic relief, and you could just kill them with the air coming off of your armor like they evaporate if you roll by them. And I think that that's really funny. And I also don't expect Gaunts to be comedic relief to that degree, but I think as the main chaff enemy, it's still too beefy, and it shouldn't be eating some of the attacks that it does. Profile-wise, I would expect with a perfectly min-max chainsword that one light attack would one-shot them, but it just doesn't right now. The Demons of Tzeentch also have like way too much HP and do not make sense for this game. The shield guy is a literal god. Taking the fury of a Thunderhammer like it's nothing to a shield is wild, but I also think that's because the mechanic does not fit the game. It doesn't fit the theme for something like a Thunderhammer, a Power Sword, or a Power Fist to hit this thing and just glance off. Even with a light attack, that thing is getting evaporated. Again, it just needs a lot of work, and it just doesn't feel very play-tested on the hardest difficulty, because these things get evaporated on tier 1 and 2, which is where most people will play, and they won't have these problems. But the worst enemies to deal with as you keep going are the Thousand Suns Marines. Thematically, it does make sense for their weapons to do so much range damage, but they're also supposed to be bad in melee, and a lot of the time, they just instantly counter you the second you get into it, and you really can't do anything about it. So you're always playing a waiting game with them, like they have some sort of crazy initiative, so you don't get orange attack, which nukes you. So I think that the counter window for dodging needs to be more lenient on their orange attack specifically, like the Tyranids, which feels very, very forgiving. And there should be an internal cooldown for every elite enemy's blue and orange attacks. Another melee problem is that enemies will actively counter you the second that you start charging your heavy attacks by instantly dodging, and their dodge is an iframe. The enemies are too smart for what you're doing. You start charging your heavy attack, they move out of the way, or they'll instantly cast a blue or orange attack, which you can't parry because you're in the middle of a heavy locked animation. If they just added that internal cooldown to blue and orange attacks, you could play around it and it wouldn't be as punishing, and it would give you that like a better feeling for setting up those big combos. That way you could like bait that blue attack and then charge your heavy and get into it. That way things just feel better to play overall. Now the Terminators can have crazy rocket tech, and I saw some people complaining about it, and they do cook. But overall, I think range damage wise, these wouldn't feel as oppressive if we had our armor tweaked to be more resistant to ranged attacks. Outside of those big pressure points, I do think that the monstrosity level enemies, they do feel fair-ish when the server isn't laggy, but the server's been pretty laggy the entire time. So like when you do get a good load, it's very easy to dodge and parry them. When you do get a bad load, you're cooked. And as time goes on, the server does keep getting worse. And on top of that, there's also an extremely bad memory leak issue. So you should restart your game after every mission for the smoothest experience. Because one thing I noticed when I was doing my Assault Marine stream was a lot of my abilities, perks, and talents literally just stopped working altogether after I was on the game for too long. So if you notice things just stop working, that's probably why. The servers are struggling and they need the most attention right now. That's obviously what affects PvE pretty heavily, but more so affects PvP, which I think is the main replayability of the game in its current state. I honestly think the game modes are a super fun throwback to what PvP shooters used to be, and it's easily the most fun you can have on the game pretty much outside of the campaign. The only real problems I have there that like some of the melee weapons feel really bad to use. As an example, in the trailer, it showed like the chainsaw like stagger locking somebody when you hit them with it, and in the current state of the game, you just get shot in the face if you try and swing a chainsaw at somebody and die instantly. And in general, the spawn trapping can get pretty out of control, but the games are fast enough that it doesn't end up being like the worst thing in the world. But something that is happening now that the game is fully released is there's a lot of hackers popping up, and they're just spamming infinite grenades and shooting through walls, so they really have to lock in on cheaters, and we all knew it was going to be a problem with easy anti-cheat, and I don't know how they're going to fix that problem at this stage, but if they don't get on top of it, PvP's fun will be removed from the game altogether. There is also problems with PvP where you end up in the infinite queue where you just can't load in, but that again ties into server issues, which if they fixed, hopefully we can get like a 12v12 or a 32v32 or something, because that would just be insanely cool. But when we talk about weapons as a generalized thing, for every single one, the skill tree needs one more perk and should be a reward from maxing the EXP out on it, so you can round a perfect build out by going vertical once. And this rewards player agency and choice more than anything, because you want to go vertical once and then go to the very end. But currently you're not allowed to do that. You have to go straight across, which in my opinion feels kind of bad. I also think, by the way, smaller problems now, execution should be added to PvP, because this is one of the coolest parts of the entire game. Well, that and the customization. And that's the best part of Warhammer altogether, is making your thing your own. It will always be like the biggest draw of the hobby, to me at least, and a lot of the really cool things are just missing. Things like different marks of power armor, or flares, like a Space Wolf having like a pelt would go a long way, and like weapon trims for like, you know, like a red trim on your weapon for like the Black Templars would be insanely cool. All these small details are things we really need, but again, it's like the preseason of the game. I know after streaming the game quite a bit, it's something my community really, really wants, and that's one of their main pressure points of like, we just want more customization. So I don't think it should be slept on, and as time goes on, they do have their roadmap for adding more customization, but I really think that these small things aren't going to be a part of that, and they really need to be, because that, again, that's what makes Warhammer special. But again, that's a small point, and that's not like a serious problem. That's just a personal hang-up. The game's main hang-up, to clarify, is that the servers and almost every problem I've had can be traced back to desync or lag. There's a bunch of insanely fun, cool, and interesting things you can do in the game. The game is just fun to play. But that's why it's important that games like this, really fun games that make you want to dump thousands of hours into them, get real feedback so that they can stay fun. And I don't expect you to agree with every single change or fix that I say, but I also have a lot of experience with games like this and how to remove pressure points without making the game face roll easy. And these are problems that most people probably run into in like 2 to 3 weeks. But blatantly denying problems is how we end up with so many games just rotting out. So my overall review is that the campaign is a throwback to what we loved from OG campaigns years ago back in the day. And honestly, this took it to a whole new level with something that I never thought that I would really get to experience again, with like amazingly done lore and literally the best like cinematic experience I've had in ages, if not the best yet. The PvE special operations are very mediocre and need a lot of work and feel almost unfinished because of the discrepancies between missions and enemies. You will definitely 100% agree with that after you do the Helldrake mission one time. PvP is just a pure fun throwback that I never thought I would be able to like experience again. It really reminded me of that like Gears of War 1 lobby style with like Modern Warfare 2 like esque lobbies, like kind of compacted together. It's a good experience, and it's the OG multiplayer that I love. So I think Space Marine 2 is definitely worth the purchase, mainly just for the campaign in its current state. And if you did want to wait a month, you have to remember this is the preseason for the game, and October is where things are really going to start to kick off. So just because people also like your numerical rating, I would say in its current state, 11 out of 10 campaign, 8 out of 10 PvP, and 6 out of 10 for special operations. Unless you play heavier Bulwark, then Spec Ops is probably closer to an 8 out of 10. And you do get all three, so you're never forced to do the thing you don't like. But more than anything, I want to know if you think the devs this time will deliver on what they promised with their interviews and roadmaps, or miss out on its true potential like every other live service game has.